You guys ready to kick off? Yeah, good. Okay. We're very lucky today because we get two speakers, not just one. Celia Roberts and Mary Lou Rasmussen are professors in the School of Sociology here at ANU. Expertise in sex, gender and sexuality. Way too many accolades to list here, so I'll keep it brief. Celia works in the area of feminist technoscience studies, focusing on reproduction, sexuality, sex, gender, embodiment and health. She's written or edited many books, including on sex hormones, genetic and reproductive technologies, early onset puberty, health biosensing, and reproduction in the face of the climate crisis. Mary Lou's research focuses on building transdisciplinary understanding of sexuality and gender across diverse life worlds, taking account of sexual citizenship, cultural and religious differences, and technologies of sexuality, education and health. And she's co-editor of the Palgrave Encyclopedia of Sexuality Education. With others, Celia and Mary Lou are authors on the 2023 book, Reproduction, Kin and Climate Crisis, Making Bushfire Babies. And they're currently collaborating on another project on young people's thoughts about having children in the climate crisis. So enough from me, over to you guys.
Thank you. Thanks, Rob, and thanks everyone for coming. It's really lovely to come here, and there's a very rich set of connections between our two schools, and we're really lovely to be invited to come and talk to you about what we've been doing. First, just want to acknowledge that we're on the Northern Ngambri country, and also acknowledge that some of the research I'm going to talk to you about today was also undertaken here, but also on Yuin country. And want to acknowledge the elders, past, present and emerging, and pay my respects to any Indigenous colleagues here today. We're going to talk to you a little bit about our book, but in the book, especially the introduction, we spend quite a lot of time talking about Indigenous land management and caring practices, particularly around fire. So really want to acknowledge the incredible expertise in First Nations peoples around dealing with this issue that we're going to be talking about today. So, are you doing the slides? Sorry, we had that sorted. There we go. So there's a book that we like very much. It's an edited collection brought out in 2018, importantly before the COVID crisis, called Making Kin, Not Population. It was edited by Donna Haraway and Adele Clark, who are two leading scholars in the field of feminist technoscience studies. And it brings together debates around environment and reproduction, and works against the tendency to silo these fields in feminist theory and gender studies. Two of the authors who write chapters in that book are people that we're very much inspired by their work, Jade Sasser and Michelle Murphy. Jade's a North American scholar and Michelle's from Canada. She's also a First Nations scholar. They point in this book to the ways in which debates about limiting population are inevitably tied up in the historical and contemporary permutations of racist logics that produce less affluent populations in the global south as overburdening the Earth's carrying capacity, while ignoring the extreme consumption practices of the global north. I'm sure this is a familiar argument to you. So that's a sort of important debate that's going on in feminist theory and in many other places. We were starting to do this book about reproduction, thinking about how reproduction and climate change come together, bringing our expertise on reproduction and sexuality into trying to think about what could be done to ameliorate climate change. We came across this article in 2017, published in The Guardian, which brings population and climate crisis together in a different way, to a focus on consumption. So it's doing the thing that they're saying that is being forgotten. We should focus on overconsumption, not on people in the global south having too many kids. And of course, as you can see here, focusing on The Guardian's readership, which like me might be vegan and like to drive EVs. So reporting here on a Swedish study about how much CO2 each decision or activity one might make would save you per year. Is that legible from the distance? Anyway, like you might eat a plant-based diet, take you down to 0.82, replace your car with a hybrid, avoid round-trip transatlantic flights. But in the middle, signaled by the massive big orange circle, is have one fewer child, which according to them will save you 58.6 tonnes per year. Seems a bit weird given that people, normally use 15 tonnes, but it's a calculation that's based also on the grandchildren. So it takes account of the child and the grandchild and splits that up across two people across their lifetimes. Anyway, the point is that it's trying to show you, and did so in this very significant article called, or sort of shocking article, Want to Fight Climate Change, Have Fewer Children, tells this story. And this is a narrative that we want to talk about how this unfolds in our two studies. This is a narrative we kept coming across. What does it mean to connect having children and climate crisis or carbon emissions in these ways? And how are Australians making sense of their reproductive lives in this discursive context? So it's really important to point out that climate crisis is not the only thing affecting people's decisions to have children. And we need to think about many different global trends that are happening. We're just going to talk about climate crisis, but here are some of the others, and we're going to talk about these when they come up. So rising rates of involuntary infertility. Obviously, this has been a problem for many decades, and the rise of reproductive technologies to address that. There's also, as we were just chatting with Pete about, rising voluntary childlessness in many countries. So many more people choosing not to have children at all. There's also aging populations, as we're all fully aware, and fear of increasing instabilities, environmental, of course, but also economic instabilities and, security issues, war, etc. We're all living this all the time. Also, and this is really relevant to our research and our teaching, actually, changing social patterns in relation to sex, gender, and family formation. So, that's a whole other space, but people's changing identities around male, female, non-binary, etc., different forms of having kids, different forms of making families together. And just wanted to point out that Australia's 2023 fertility rate was 1.78 live births per woman. So what we're talking about today is not happening in isolation. All of these things are happening at once. So when we were talking about working together for the first time, I just recently moved to Canberra, talking about environmental crisis and reproduction. Then the summer of 2019, 2020 happened, and the local bushfires. So we decided this would be an amazing chance to do a study thinking about this incredible event that happened and thinking about how that affected people's experiences of having babies. There was also, as some of you might know, a big medical project that was initiated at the same time in the medical school here with other universities, University of Canberra and other places, called Mother and Child 2020. And we were associated with that. They did a sort of larger qualitative study that we were part of, and we're also sort of a side branch of them. They were doing a medical study of the effects of the smoke on both the pregnant women and their children. They're still hoping to follow up those children 5 years later. So with Rebecca Williamson, who's sitting here, who was working with us and did almost all these interviews. Thank you, Rebecca, beautifully done. We interviewed 24 people who'd had babies or were pregnant during the bushfires in the ACT and Southeast New South Wales, and sometimes their partners. Of course, these mostly occurred during COVID, so it was extremely difficult to recruit people. And we only had $30,000, so it's quite a small study, but we've made a lot out of it. With what they told us was kind of amazing. So Rebecca often had to do the interviews online, but sometimes got in between a lockdown, was able to go and meet with people face to face. And we're talking to them for 1 to 2 hours about their feelings about having had a baby, what it was like being pregnant at that time, and what their thoughts were, particularly sort of going forward. How had this experience, both of COVID and the bushfires, changed their thoughts about having families? Unsurprisingly, relatively high socioeconomic status and high education levels in this sample, and they were mostly white and almost all heterosexual, which isn't ideal for us in terms of they're not a representative sample in any way, but we just made that work and really thinking about quite a privileged group of people and what that experience was for them. And we're not going to talk about this here, but part of that is a loss of the sort of the sense of control that often comes with privilege was kind of a big shock to people. Right, yes. Oh yeah, the photos, yeah. So we also did, and this turned out to be a really interesting part of the book, Rebecca asked people, did they have any photos of that time? She was often interviewing them up to a year later, wasn't it? So 9 months to a year later. And people just got out their phones and shared with us photos, not of people, but of their homes, their street, you know, all those incredible photos that you've probably all got in your phones too, of skies and smoke. And we got if you go to the website of Bristol University Press, all those pictures are there in colour because we couldn't publish them in colour in the book, but they're very evocative and very give a really sort of sense of the claustrophobic, smoky quality of that time and what it was like to be at home with a baby or to be heavily pregnant during that period. So I encourage you to check out the website. So there's an example of one. I mean, sorry, it brings back pretty bad memories to a lot of people. Like, they get that feeling of not being able to breathe again. But there we are, that intense smoky period. For people who weren't here, there may be some students who weren't here. There was a massive local fire in Canberra on the 27th of January 2020, which burnt about 80% of our local national park and 3,350 hectares of rural land. So there was that huge fire. And as we know, and that's why we got the picture of the helicopter on the front cover, that was started by that terrible accident with the helicopter. With guys stopping to go to the toilet. Anyway, it was a tough time. And also, of course, all the fires down the coast as well. Next slide. So some of our people were very close to fires and were evacuated many times and had that experience of being evacuated with a newborn or being heavily pregnant. And some were just living in Canberra but weren't actually evacuated because most people in Canberra were not. The times at 10. So we're just going to show you quotes now, not about that experience. So sorry, I'm not going to go down that line. Have to read the book. I'm going to talk to you about the final question that Rebecca asked, which was, how has this made you think? Has this made you think differently about having children in the future? I can't remember the exact wording, Rebecca. Maybe you can. But so this is their thoughts about what does it mean about thinking about reproduction. So Libby, who's a doctor in her early 30s. So these are people that have had babies already. And she says, well, if we were environmentally, ethically and financially conscious, none of us would have children. The race probably needs to die out. Let's be, I guess she's going to say, honest. And from both a personal and a sociological context, we should probably stop breeding. There are too many humans. But I guess biology is a really strong driver because here I am with a baby despite that. People who love, this is a very important theme that came up a lot, people who love and care for the environment and want to raise a child who is, you know, emotionally connected and engaged in the world, we need those people. So if all the people who are raising those sorts of kids aren't having kids because ethically we probably shouldn't, I think the human race is actually more fucked, not less, pardon the French, because then we have a whole pile of people who maybe aren't aware or engaged, and that's a problem because you're not going to stop everyone. So this theme that nice people like us will have what some people call eco-warriors was a really important sort of post hoc explanation of why, you know, your answer to this very tricky question, well, why are you having a child if you think there's so many people or we're, you know, going down the road of climate crisis?
We're also keenly aware that this was something that would be quite sensitive for people. And so we're thinking about that a lot in the analysis and the way that we talk about it. And obviously these people were pregnant and parenting through COVID and the bushfires. Yeah. And the reason that we asked this question last is because we really wanted to think about what it meant. And we had lots of conversations about whether or not to even ask the question. So I think Rebecca asked the question with a very soft touch. Yes. Not in an accusatory fashion, are you thinking of having more children? But it was to open up a conversation about whether or not they had thought about it. I just think it's, important to characterize that because we did think about it a lot
and we've written in the book about our own experiences having children and how, some of us have children, some of us don't. So we're not, we're not pointing the fingers at anyone. Rebecca actually had a baby during the project. So, we're not naming and shaming. We're trying to think about how do people engage with these discourses and how does it play out for them, So this is another woman and same age, works in the private sector. And I think this is interesting for Canberra people because she's talking about the emotional toll of this thing, the climate crisis coming to Canberra. She says Canberra always kind of felt untouchable. It's such a pretty, what's the word, mild, but not a lot happens here that's really scary. like it didn't used to happen like that. And they talk about the Canberra bubble in terms of like the socio-demographics as well. It's a pretty affluent sort of little community. We used to be able to go where, do what we want to do, really go to work, go to cafes. But I think it's a bit of a wake-up call. And Mary Lou wrote a really interesting chapter about the COVID bubbles, you know, that you're allowed to have a bubble, and then this idea of Canberra bubble, and that idea of, is there somewhere that you can be safe? People yearning for a place of safety, and for a place of safety to bring up their baby. It's a reasonable, have their baby and bring up their baby. Worthwhile pointing out, Canberra Hospital was absolutely filled with smoke. So people were going to hospital to have a baby in a shockingly smoke-filled environment, which was very confronting, both to the clinicians and to the clinicians as well. They were pretty shocked by that too.
And one of our collaborators in the medical school talked about people who were pregnant and parenting coming to the hospital and like walking through this literally smoke-filled corridor to have a consultation about their baby and not mentioning the smoke, which was really like,
the clinicians not mentioning the smoke.
The women were,
yeah.
like, he thought that they'd at least comment on the fact that you could barely see down the corridor. But like what was on their minds was the health of their baby, not the fact that the hospital was like clearly actually contributing to that because it couldn't cope environmentally with what was going on around it.
Yeah, but then some of the women said they were asking their doctors about it, and the doctors were like, no. You know, like, because it's I mean, that's the whole reason the medical school's doing this research. There is very little research about what being in a smoky environment while you're pregnant does to the development of a child. I mean, it's just not known. So there was a sort of two-way thing, wasn't there, about that? So, you know, here she says, I feel like I'm still young. I've got a lot of life to live. And I look at my kids and I'm like, God, how are you going to have to manage? Like, what are you going to have to deal with? So that sense about, you know, believing that your kid is going to be the person that's part of the solution, but also this real concern that we can't even imagine how hard it's going to be for this next generation.
Which is also interesting as well, isn't it? Because it's not just a conversation that people are having with themselves about how many, but it's also about what conditions you're going to be raising your children in is a really common theme that keeps coming up in the interview. So like, what's the world going to be like in 30 years or 50 years? That, like, how will my child cope in that world?
I think for us, this talk is really interesting because actually when we talked more with her, or Rebecca did, she had grown up in the part of Canberra that had been really devastated by the 2003 fires. So there's a really interesting sense of the safety of Canberra, even though we know it's not. And I think really probably what she's talking about is social class. Yeah, that sense that you can, you know, have a good house, travel away when you want to, etc. So part of what we do as humans, and sociologically and psychologically, is sort of push the badness into the future. This is okay now because we're living it, but there's going to be worse to come. And I think and we forget how bad the past has been. Oh, there's the question. Did the bushfires or anything else this year impact at all on your thoughts about having kids in general? And Lisa, same woman, says, that's a good question. You know, I think it might have. I hadn't really thought about it in that way. Before we had to, it always sort of said, oh yeah, 2 or 3 kind of thing. After this, like, I don't know if it was just the external, like environmental stuff, or whether it was also miscarriages or health issues or whatever, but we're just both like, no, we're done. 2 in, 2 out, net zero. Amazing use of that climate crisis, climate policy language. We're really amazed she said that. Climate change, the world actually becoming too sick and not being sustainable. So are you going to put children into it? Like, maybe that's a selfish thing to do. And I guess that idea of selfishness is really such a kind of gendered language, isn't it? And a class language too, that somehow wealthy people are selfish, they gather things for themselves, and that women are selfish to want to have children. I think it's a highly problematic, but something that comes up over and over again, that it's selfish, you know. Doesn't feel like that when you're pregnant, does it? Kind of feels like the opposite. Anyway, so that's a kind of interesting combination of that climate change language and a language about deciding to have kids. So this is one of our few male interviewees who's a data analyst. I think you can probably tell by the way he speaks. So he says, given all we know about the climate and all the modelling, where would be the best place to live? You know, that the place that's most insulated from the various extremes. I'm actively looking to figure out, like, is there some place, maybe inland, that's more stable or insulated by geographical features like mountains? And, you know, but how do you balance that with community? So whatever area has the most buffers built in, you know, mountains, water, whatever, I think that might be the safest, and I am looking for it. We probably won't make any move like that for several years. Again, we kick this into the future, but at least it's definitely in my consciousness. And I imagine such places will start to have a much higher attraction. So you ideally want to get in there before the land property values go up. I mean, this is such a particular view, isn't it? But this, again, this yearning for the place that won't be affected. And I think it came through so strongly that people thought they were already there. They thought Canberra was this place. And the experience of loss of that safety and the sense that, as you will remember, you know, the highway to Sydney is on fire, the highway south's on fire, you can't get to the coast. You know, people moving around from their beach house to their home to, you know, to try and escape, and, you know, there's no escape. Ironically, that guy did move to Melbourne and got stuck there in COVID. So wasn't, you know, again, there's nowhere to go. There's nowhere to go. So that's not much of a solution. I'm going to hand over to you.
So what about people who do not have children yet? What are their thoughts? And like, we understand also that they might not have children. And that's right. And we want to also just do a shout out here to Greta Bartel, who was a master's student at Fenner, who worked with us on doing the first tranche of interviews and analysis of this data. It was great to have her on board. So we also worked with undergraduates in a research internship in the School of Sociology, and partially our thinking around that was to try and get people who weren't 50-something women to talk to young people about it in a way that didn't seem too imperious or, well, darling, tell us about what your reproductive future is going to be. So we were kind of hoping for it to be a little bit more of a peer-to-peer conversation, which was, you know, had like interesting, I think, implications for the data, because there were things that certainly weren't followed up that we would have loved to follow up, but also I think, you know, it was a conversation among peers. And so we had a focus on environmentalists, men, LGBTIQ+, and young people without university education, because the first round of interviews that we did with Greta was a bit like the people that we focused on for the people who are pregnant and parenting. So we wanted a more diverse group, but it's still not a huge amount. There was 36 interviews altogether. All right, so this is a quote from Abby. So I have the equipment, but I'm not going to use it. No adding to the population, the number of children in poverty, the number of children that are living in just awful situations, and then climate change is just making all of those a million times worse. People are living way longer than we used to, and that means we do have an aging population. I don't want to say that we should be killing people off. That's not what I'm saying, but we are reproducing way faster than we ever have in the history of the world. We are reproducing so much faster than we ever have before, and I don't want to contribute to that. So like, we're actually talking with Peen before we started today, and Peen was asking the question about, like, has the idea that population growth is, the population numbers are still going up, but the fertility rates are going down, and how much is that influencing the conversations we're having about reproduction into the future? And I think the answer at the moment is probably still not much. I think that there's still a sense that there is too many of us, and that we need to, you know, hit panic stations now. And I think that this is one example, I think, of that kind of discourse within the interviews. And so Jessica was also talking about this. Overpopulation was another factor for me. I'm absolutely capable physically. It's interesting, like, how do they know that they're capable physically? Like, they just kind of assumed, everybody assumed that they were fertile, no problems with fertility in this group, which we've also written a piece about. Yeah. I don't want to bring another human being into this world, the world that I feel like it's collapsing. And like, one of the conversations as well we've been having is, like, you know, when's the best time to ask people about their fertility? Do you ask them when they're in their 20s, in their 30s, or in their 40s? And kind of what one conclusion I think that we've come to is that actually it doesn't, like there's never a right time to ask people about their fertility, and actually kind of what's interesting is the response they give at different times in their life. Because I think that like the idea that you can pin it down and find people at the right age, I think is also kind of misguided when you think about the way that like other research has been done in this space to try and like get a conclusive answer about your fertility. Amelia, in terms of children, I need to be de-identified because I could never say this in public. I did a research paper when I was at uni about having an ethical feminist worldview and about the ethics of having children. And basically the conclusion that I reached is that the most ethical thing you can do as an individual is to not have kids. Because as an individual, having one child is like the single biggest thing you can do to contribute to climate change. If you go back to that slide we used, that slide is in people's brains. Like it's become like a received wisdom, and we're really seeing it a lot in these conversations. So where are we up to? Kristen.
Oh, sorry, Kristen.
So Kristen is talking about with the resources that we have, we could actually feed everyone. So she's like pushing back against these discourses. We're not really overpopulated. We do have resources, but it's just because people in Western countries use more resources than they need. I think it's interesting that the First Nations woman is the person who like was pushing back against these issues as well, and seeing it, like she was the only person in the project who called it a racist dog whistle, which I think was a really, like she was really like highlighting the race politics of population discussions and reproduction in a way, like it came up a little bit in other conversations, but not quite in this way. Like the families in Western countries, they already usually have smaller families and low birth rates, who are actually the issue and the problem sort of thing. So I mean, I really don't care for increasing the birth rate, because the only real reason I've seen to do that is to improve the economy. Another way to do that increased population is to take in more refugees or international students, God forbid, and then we have a bigger population. But we don't want to do that because those people are the wrong colour, you know. So it's interesting, like how she's speaking about how these different politics are interconnecting, and very timely today. And Josh talks about, to be honest, the climate change aspect on having kids is probably like for me number 5. I love this on my list. I mean, I feel like you have either kids or like you don't. I don't know if it's possible to like change the climate back to normal. So I think if you want to have kids, you just have to have them and then adapt to what the environment is now and hopefully not make it worse. So and I think that this is really, like, I love this response as well, because I think that I actually like, I think when you ask people if they want to have kids or not, often it's opaque to them, like when they might have children and why. It's kind of like, you know, it's really kind of a sucky question to ask, because you kind of assume that people know the answer. And so often I think we don't know the answer, and like where it is in our, you know, top 10 list, I think can be difficult to determine.
Yeah.
But Jack's really interesting as well here. I would assume that by the time I would want to have kids, then it was almost at the point, because it's going to be so far, Jack's going to be 50, I think, before we could reach net zero. Well, like, yeah, kind of decrease our carbon emissions. Hopefully by, you know, this time in the future when I have kids, surely by that time we'll have the technology and stuff that maybe could offset whatever damage with links, and maybe it could be like a kind of like neutral. And I think it's, you know, people talk about techno-optimists in regards to the climate. And I think that like that sense of, you know, techno-optimism is really, I think, coming through as well in the interviews, and how people are imagining, like how they want to imagine their futures.
The other thing might be worth mentioning there is a lot of the guys, I mean, they were being interviewed by a woman peer, so, you know, maybe this was part of it, but there was a lot of, they were being sort of nice guys and saying, well, it's up to the woman, really. You know, I am not the one who's going to make that decision. So if she really wants her will, she doesn't really want her way. And so there was a bit, you know, which you can read in 2 ways. It was a bit of like, not really my responsibility, but wanting to be sort of ethical around their relationships with their women partners.
It was almost like the language of, like, you know, if you about contraception and also making decisions about abortion, it's like the, you know, it's the women's choice. I think it was also something that certainly came through.
Yeah.
So people who already have babies express strong concerns about the future, but believe their children will be part of the solution. Many say that the climate crisis affects their thoughts about family size and where they might live. And people who do not yet have children express worries about climate crisis and what the next generation will face. However, they also mention housing, finances, access to reproductive medicine, family composition and careers is all really important in decision making. And some are critical of the idea of overpopulation, but it remains a common trope in people's imaginings of reproductive futures. And these are some questions that we thought might kick off the conversation.
So yeah, I mean, we're really interested. I mean, partly because, you know, we're aware that we share a course with you guys. We share a staff member, Beck Pierce. So thinking about where can these conversations take place? Conversations that bring questions of population, reproduction and climate crisis into critical connection. And so where are we able to, we want to know what you guys are doing about that, if anything, and where we could, how we can collaborate around that. And then we're interested in the public debate, because as Mary Lou was saying before, there is a sort of shift with more, you know, I see it a lot on my feed because I'm interested in this stuff, but lots of countries reporting low fertility, high concerns about there not being enough children, you know, whole villages in Japan closing down because there's not enough kids. So there is, I think, this interesting shift that isn't yet reflected in our data, but might be in the next 5 years. So where can, apart from the pages of the Guardian, where can this public debate and this kind of, we think, really important intergenerational discussion? So where do older people who have a chance to talk to younger people about this? I think that's a really interesting conversation that could be had. And then, of course, I mean, hopefully this is underpinning everything that we're saying and that's clear. How can we address those inequalities, including colonization and climate crisis as connected processes? And we can't keep talking about those things as separate. They are absolutely together. But anyway, we'd like to hear any responses or questions. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Carl.
Absolutely fascinating. And as you say, so many conversation directions you can go in. So we'll see where it goes. Questions? Yeah. That's up.
Thank you very much. Is this on? Okay, it is. Yeah, really, really interesting. I was wondering if you got any self-reports about how much people are keeping track of the climate crisis. So whether there's a difference in response type based on how much they're, you know, keeping track of it, as opposed to it's something that they don't really think about very deeply.
I mean, strong connection between caring a lot and worrying a lot. So we've got data on each person. We ask them to, the students ask them to sort of on a scale of 1 to 5, how much you care about this kind of thing. So, I mean, I don't have those numbers in my head, but yeah, if you were very worried about the environment or felt passionate, felt well educated about it, knowledgeable, much more likely to be concerned about having children. Yeah. So those guys that are like, oh, that's going to be fine. They were low on the scale of knowing much or caring much.
Yeah. And there were certainly young men who were really worried about the environment and worried about having children.
Yes,
and
they it's a gender split.
Yeah, but it was interesting as well. Like I think with the young men, like they were worrying about it, but the young women were kind of like feeling that worry in a very intense way. It was kind of an embodied worry.
Yeah, right.
Like they talked about it making them feel sick. So it was interesting. Like they were both like there was concern among. But it was gendered just in that sense of like how intense they felt it was, and maybe that the intensity of the language they used to describe.
Yeah.
Which I think it's interesting because as in 2 of those quotes, they both say, oh, I've got the equipment, I can, you know, there's sort of, they push away the idea of infertility.
Yeah.
But actually I've written a lot of stuff on infertility and, you know, there is also, young women are also contending today with the idea that you're highly likely to be infertile. There's a sort of production of every woman as possibly infertile through, you know, monitoring of menstruation, monitoring of ovulation, people being encouraged, you know, to not leave it too late. So I think even though they brought it up in a sort of refusing way, I think they are, what we'd say, subjectified, come into a sense of identity through those discourses as well.
Right.
So I think it's double whammy for the women because they're like, you know, oh, I'm supposed to be getting on and having kids, but actually this is a really difficult decision. I've got to have my partner lined up, I've got to have my house, I've got to have my job, I've got to have my, you know, there's all those sense of all these things, and climate crisis was That makes sense to me. There's a very visceral.
Yeah.
I think.
And sorry, if I can ask one more question, do you know if people if people's responses will change if the climate crisis wasn't an issue? So if people, for example, if they kind of felt I'm not really interested in having kids anyway, so climate change is one kind of another way to, I don't want to say justify,
There
but
was a study done in Scandinavia, I think it was done in Sweden, and they asked people from, I think, aged 18 to 90 about their reproductive intentions, or not about how they thought about the relationship between climate and reproduction, but came up in general conversation about the future. And the researchers in that study kind of made an argument which we disagree with, which is that the participants in the study were using the language of climate as a get out of reproduction free card with conversations with family, but our sense was that I think that generally it was like more genuine than that. I think kind of the struggles that people were going through around making decisions around it, and that they weren't if they didn't want to have kids, they were just saying, I don't want to have kids, and there was enough other reasons that they could turn to do it, that didn't have to be.
okay.
I think the argument is that kind of what you were.
Yeah, right. But,
Which might be a Scandinavian thing.
Yeah,
about
I was
now,
wondering
but
about
there's
that,
much
yeah.
more complicated. Maybe it's more complicated.
I
in
see.
Canada too, in Scandinavia.
Okay.
I don't know,
I think it's pretty complicated. Yeah,
it's pretty complicated.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Who's next?
I had a question. It seemed that many of the responses were quite individualized. So they're about individuals making decisions for themselves and seeing reproduction as being an individual reproduction of self through children. But my understanding, I haven't read this Making Kin Not Population book, but I understand some of Haraway's work where there's a suggestion that we could actually create different social relations, that we could actually see kinship beyond direct self-reproduction. And I'm just wondering, did any of the respondents talk about alternative kinship relations as an alternative to having kids as just self-reproduction?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, great question, Jasper. Yes, so I've just written a paper, which is just out for review somewhere, about people's idea about adoption and also about dogs. Because animals is a really important part of it, as other ways of doing family, doing kinship. It comes up in the feminist literature, but it also comes up in people's stories about their lives. I mean, it comes up, I know your students, with my students, it's often really important, like their dogs really matter to them. Not that they're baby substitutes, but they're ways of doing kin and care for other beings in ways that are really important to them. And in a way I consider quite problematic as an adoptive parent, people often figured adoption as the virtuous way of having children, because you're not adding to the planet, but really with very little knowledge of what that would mean to their life, and
or the structural issues around it.
Where adopted kids come from, you know, any of the sort of issues that arise in adoption. So there was a kind of sense that, there could be this better way. And actually, Donna Haraway, whose work I love, does the same thing. So I'm sort of critiquing her for my paper, but she also says, oh, well, you know, maybe 3 people could adopt 1 child and that would be good. Really, where are those children coming from and what are the complexities of that? It's not a simple solution. So there's a bit of it, but I think we need to, part of this elaborating discussion about, well, how can we live with each other, care for each other, you know, how can people get that sort of feeling of care and love and connection without having children if they don't want to have children?
I'm actually kind of disappointed and frustrated about how little language there is for other ways of thinking about kinship, I think. And if you think about the way that people imagine, I think if you think about the way people imagine the life course, it's still so heteronormative. And I think that there is that, and also related to particular understandings of all these conversations we have about housing, so little of them are about different ways that we might live together, and actually providing financial and legal mechanisms whereby we can do kinship differently. One of the participants also just on this point, made the statement that she'd given her cat a last name that was the same as her mother's, as a way of like assuaging her mother's desire to have a grandchild, and that she was like providing her with a grand cat, which I can't imagine that the grandmother was overly thrilled by the substitution, but it shows that it was on their minds, that how they were trying to work that stuff. Yeah.
Well, yes, that's very interesting. Perhaps I'm the oldest person in the room, because I'm thinking some of these, when you've raised these questions in the context of the bushfires, whenever it was, about 5 years ago,
yeah.
But I'm old enough to have come from the generation whose parents were married or new parents at the time of the Second World War, which had a pretty dramatic effect on how people thought, which were many of the same things that you were raising came up then. So, for example, quite a lot of people, I'm thinking of Australia, but I can think of a bunch of other countries as well. People are often, people who are going off to war as soldiers or whatever, there was an advantage in getting married first, because for one thing, your girlfriend could, if you got killed off, she kept the pension, or at least a partial pension. That was a positive. Yeah. Second, there was no social ill relations to being married for a bit before you getting a bit of sex on going before you went. That was a factor too, especially when it was the same, when we were still in the same country. But not so many were keen, or just about everybody was not keen to take children in those circumstances straight off, because you were going to get left with kids left in the middle of nowhere. So it's a little bit, and so there was a history against against having kids till sometime later, quite strongly. And it's a little bit of reminding me of what you were talking about there. And even then, in Australia, at least, the average reproduction rates, numbers of children, were higher than they are now, but not vastly orders of magnitude. I mean, there were children. I mean, there are people my age who were children out of 8 children or something, but they were much rarer than the generation before them, a long way. So some of those things are not new effects.
No.
And there's a historical, and indeed, if you looked around some of our countries around the region, some that have been war-torn at more recent times, I think you might find some of the same effects.
Exactly. I mean, that's why that slide we had, like the third slide about global trends, so war, finances, effectiveness of contraception, medical technologies, ideas about women going to work. I mean, that massively changed. Both world wars changed that, didn't it, about how much middle class women should work, working class women were always working, issues of migration, ideas about parenting. When you think of all those children, especially in Britain, or in Europe, who were sent away from their family during the war and all the trauma that caused. So there's, I mean, the context is always of its time.
Like the pill hadn't happened in the time he's talking about, which was like a massive technological shift as well. Yeah, in terms of capacity to control fertility, and also I think in the 60s, I lived for quite a while in Idaho, in the United States, and Idaho was a place where people went when they were going to tap out, but and to have children, but in kind of off-grid, under the fear of nuclear war. So I think you're right. You have to historicize it both in terms of technologies, country context, and also thinking about these things are always changing.
And there is a similarity there, isn't there, between the sense that nuclear war would be globally catastrophic but yet the wish to find somewhere safe. And I think we're seeing an echo of that in this, climate crisis will be everywhere, but of course worse in some places for at least some of the time. So maybe we can escape somewhere. I think and that we associate having children with that desire to escape and take them somewhere safe, which is, a very sort of natural desire, but it gets played out. Yeah, huge echoes, huge echoes. I mean, these are these people's parents or grandparents. So of course we don't reinvent. Each generation pulls ideas and feelings from the previous generation and morphs them in through contact with the current world. So yeah, it's not surprising there's strong echoes. Yeah.
Other question? What's that?
Online one.
Oh, let's go for it. Yeah. Sorry.
Kendra asks, she might have missed it, but did religion emerge at all as a factor affecting the views on reproduction and climate crisis?
Did ask about religion.
Yeah, no, as a short, we did ask about it, but it did not come up as a thing that and that also is probably about who we spoke to and also who didn't want to speak to us. Even though we did have we had a group of, these young interviews, but none of them I think would have identified as part of a religious community. I think if you went and talked to a religious community, you would probably find some quite different answers. And and the Catholic Church is certainly still plugging, that we should be having as many children as we can and not intervening. So I think that, and that's an issue for sure.
That was great, thanks. I got a couple of comments and a question on the comment side. Do you know about Biami Williamson's paper on the South Coast? And yeah, okay,
We cite that in the book. Yeah.
terrific. Yeah, I found it really powerful for him to just state plainly the demography of the people who are affected down the coast.
And that's just to say, if people haven't read it, that he talks about how much more Indigenous children and Indigenous parents were affected than other people.
And that it's a young skewing population. Yeah, so Indigenous children particularly. Yeah.
There was this whole period of negotiation where we were working with some Indigenous scholars at the university, and we might have been able to go down and talk to them, but in the end it wasn't possible because the level of trauma was too difficult. So it's sort of shadowy in the book, but we were aware of it, and it was an element of MC 2020 where Stuart Sutherland, his name is, isn't it? And I haven't got all his name, but who were working with that community and trying to talk with them about and get them enrolled in the study, at least in the medical side, to try and look at what happened to those babies, because really, really important. That additional burden of losing country is so huge.
And I suppose also the interesting contrast to the Canberra population being particularly white and, well, privileged in other ways.
Yeah, exactly.
And also on the comment side, I'm fascinated by, on the Guardian graphic and other similar things, what are considered options. Obviously if you're talking to a different community, it wouldn't be about whether or not you drive an electric car or have one less kid. It might be about what fuel you use in your home stove, or how you collect food, and then
How many animals you have.
exactly, yeah. So I think that's just an observation I thought was interesting. On the question side, in a way, we addressed it with that interesting conversation about kinship, but I was really curious. Primarily, the responses were sort of negatively framed in the sense of, climate change makes me fear for my children, or fear for whether or not I should have children.
Yeah.
But in a sense, I think of having a child, for some people, might be an expression of hope in the future, or an expression of having a stake in the future.
Yeah.
And in a way, the kinship idea could broaden different ways of having a stake. And I'm curious whether anyone ever expressed it in those positive terms, to say, no, I'm going to have a kid because I want there to be a brighter future and for my children to be part of my stake in that future.
It certainly came across.
Do you think, there was one in the bushfire study, there was one person, but they were also a sociologist, who
They were also,
a sociologist.
Oh, okay. You wouldn't trust them.
Who had a very strong statement about that, but they were doing that from a really strong awareness of this other discourse that we were talking about. So it sort of was difficult.
But there were the eco warrior thing came across quite a lot. That sense that you were giving birth to children who were the hope for the future.
I guess I was trying to avoid it not necessarily that my child is going to fix the future, but you could put it almost the other way and say that choosing to not have a child is the most selfish thing you could do, because it's saying, screw the future. It's so far gone that I'm not even going to be, my genes are not going to be a part of the future. You know?
Yeah, you could make that argument, but I think that I think that that's kind of unutterable.
Yeah.
So
I'm sorry I uttered it.
I think people might think it,
Yeah.
but they probably don't want to say it.
And the
because
eco warrior version is slightly more.
That's right.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
It's like, what's the more like politically,
Yeah.
you know, saleable.
Yeah, no, that's a
Yeah.
fair
I
point.
think what goes against that's all is that people are more, they're not so much worried about climate, like carbon emissions, they're worried about what their children will have to deal with.
Yes, the world.
And they're worried about, and that's,
Yep.
seems realistic to me that we
Yep.
should be worrying about that. And that is quite a frightening, people like to imagine that they'll have children and give them the best of what they had and then add some nicer things, that life will be good, people have a nice future. So people would constantly say to us, well, are my kids going to be able to run around outside? Are they going to, how are they going to live with
There was quite a lot of
temperatures?
nostalgia around like
Yeah.
what their childhood was like and whether or not their children would have the same, advantages they did, like solastalgia.
Yeah.
Did you have a question?
I guess.
Do you want to catch?
A lot of thoughts,
Yeah.
partly because like being quite a young person myself, this is something I think about like pretty much all the time.
Yeah.
Like for my own life. I guess this idea of like going back to your qualitative research, like the cis guy who was talking about, oh, I'm 25, but maybe I won't have kids for another 20 years sort of thing.
Yeah.
And like, I think like as a female, that's crazy. Like we're like, that's like not very possible for a lot of us because of those infertility issues. But I guess like did much come up in your interviews about like maybe particularly with women about this fear of, oh, but if it is okay in 10, 15, 20 years and things are looking good, I've run out of time. Because like for me, my parents were born in the 60s. My brother's 16. My parents are like almost 60 now. My father passed away and my mom is like quite disabled now from a work injury. And it's like, if they had kids when they were younger, would that necessarily be as much of an impactful issue on us now? And anecdotally, I think a lot of people think about, am I going to be too old when my children are teenagers and things like that? Am I going to be around enough? Am I going to be around when I have grandkids and things like that?
Yeah. I don't think that did come up. It's interesting that it didn't, but that is, as you say, that's a general concern.
We did ask, Lily to look at the biological clock.
Oh, that's right, we did.
There was a little bit of stuff on that, but it wasn't a huge thing because everybody used to assume that they were wildly fertile. And I think that that's also about who we were talking to, because I think that, if we talk to people who were like between 35 and 45, it would have been a very different set of responses, I think. But talking to people who were like, we started at 24, and I think that 24 to 35 age group, especially for women, I think is a slightly different. I don't know how old you are, but like I think that
Yeah, 24.
it's interesting, like to think about, like I think that sense of like the only people that really had thought a lot about their fertility were the queer people, kind of because they had to.
Yeah.
And they talked about access to IVF, getting counselling around IVF, and how that was really helping them clarify what they wanted to do. So the people who knew that they had to think about it, and actually were kind of further along the road in making those steps, which I thought was interesting.
And I guess sort of like maybe intertwining two issues, this concept of kinship and then this concept of like the global south, global north, developing versus developed nations and racism and around overpopulation takes me back to when I did my bachelor's. We had a lecture on overpopulation. It was this like older white guy from a really privileged background, and he was talking about these sorts of things. But like the thing we all sort of took away was, okay, we in the West or the developed world, we're over consuming, but I don't think that people are necessarily going to reduce their consumption enough
to like balance it out. But I think for people from more culturally diverse and Indigenous backgrounds, there is more sort of diversity around kinship and things like that. Did that come up much?
It didn't, and it would be interesting to explore that more. I think that was something.
Not big enough group.
Yeah, I think really not a big enough group, but I think that idea about, there's certainly the idea came up, but this sense that there's too many people in the global south. That did come up quite a lot. I mean, I haven't put it up here, it's very difficult material to talk about, but that sense that in other places, there's too many people is very, people understand that's difficult when you talk about, but it's also there. And this again, as Mary Lou said, ties into questions of immigration, really interesting way. And you know, one of our participants put that up and we showed you. But yeah, I think that's the idea. There's other ways relating to each other. It's not, maybe it's the way we ask the questions, but people didn't talk much about.
Just quickly, I'll slip a question in. Are there any insights from those countries that have very low fertility? And I'm thinking South Korea and Japan and places like that. Are there insights there? Is climate a big factor in those people's thinking? Do we know anything about that?
I'm working with people in Taiwan, which has low fertility. And they, when I try and ask that question, they're like, nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
Nothing to do with it. What do you mean? Why are you asking me about climate? You know.
That's my guess. Yeah.
So I don't know much about Japan or Korea, but that's the sense in Taiwan.
Yeah.
Or for them, it's about women's roles. It's about
Is that
money.
climate?
Yeah.
And then, but you know, and then governments are giving people money to try and get them to do it. And it's not having any effect. It's about women's lives.
Yeah.
And gender roles, and I don't know. You know, people thinking about life in a different way. But it's super. I mean, we would love to do a project with more collaborators in different countries to pull out. So we're working with some people in Denmark, or Mary Lou's, and in Denmark is another thing.
Yeah.
As we said, they have different ideas about having kids. So each place has different landscapes.
And those comparisons are fascinating, I think. Yeah. Anyway, look, time's up. So thanks very much for fascinating.